the Independent Christian Church of God. Presented by G.C. LaMar.
Well, hello everyone. Have a Sabbath greetings to all. Glad to see everyone here. This is a wonderful cold Sabbath day. Here in the first Sabbath of the civil year of 2025. We put the old December behind us, and here we are in January. And I think it's on the 9th of January that Jimmy Carter's funeral will be given. He lived 100 years of age. He was in hospice for over a year. I think it was a year and some months, several months. Quite an interesting commentary on that. Most anybody else would be dead within 6 months at the most, nearly. There's, of course, the terrorist act that happened on the civil year, New Year's in New Orleans, where a man rode his car through the crowd on Bourbon Street in New Orleans and killed, I think, 14 people. Horrible. Just totally horrible. And then there was the truck that blew up in of the Trump's building, at the Trump building. They trying to blow up the Trump building. This another terrorist act. Is that what 2025's got to offer for us? A lot of terrorist acts. There's been, like, I think 7 plane crashes where multiple people were died, killed in the plane crashes. It's terrible. I don't know what holds. You know, we got the inauguration, I think, on the 20th of this month of January, when Donald Trump will become the president. 47th president. He was the 45th, and he'll be the 47th. Interesting. He says he's going to be at Jimmy Carter's funeral. A lot of people out there have tried to murder him. We pray that he makes it and everything, and all goes well. Now, what we're going to do today is a little different. But before I go into what we're fixing to go into, and I don't know how long this will take. It might be short. It might be long. We'll find out. Because I have all these notes in front of me, and we're going to try to go through them. I'm not going to read the verses, but I am going to give biblical reference. I'm going to tell a short thing of what Jesus has done, what he did when he was on earth, and I'm going to share this about Jesus Christ. And then, and next Sabbath, I'm thinking about maybe, not for sure yet, maybe about going into a message about the law of God and going into a detailed, well, I wouldn't say detailed, pretty much like I'm fixing to do today, give reference, tell what the law of God is and biblical reference to it, and just go through the various laws of God. People say that they can't, I've heard people say that you can't keep the law of God. That's not true. It's not true at all. It's not burdensome whatsoever. It's rather easy if you apply yourself. It takes discipline. So let's talk about Jesus Christ. Preparation for the ministry, birth, childhood, and hidden years. Let's go through it. All right, here we go. Now, like I say, I'm going to talk about real fast what it is as a reference, and then the scripture reference. John the Baptist's birth foretold. Luke chapter 1, verse 5 through 25. Jesus' birth foretold. Luke chapter 1, verse 26 through verse 26 through 38. Mary visits cousin Elizabeth. Luke chapter 1, verse 39 to 56. The birth and naming of John the Baptist. Luke chapter 1, verses 57 through 66. Zechariah's song at John's birth. Luke chapter 1, verse 67 through 80. Joseph's dream and obedience. Matthew chapter 1, verse 18 through 24. The birth of Jesus. Matthew chapter 1, verse 25, and Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. Angelic announcement to the shepherds. Luke chapter 2, verse 8 through 20. Circumcision and naming of Jesus. Matthew chapter 1, verse 25. Luke chapter 2, verse 21. Jesus' preparation in the temple. Luke chapter 2, verse 22 through 38. All right. The Magi visit and honor Jesus as a child. Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Joseph and Mary's flight to Egypt with Jesus. Matthew chapter 2, verse 13 through 15. Herod has children killed. Matthew chapter 2, verse 16 through 18. Jesus' family returns to Nazareth. Matthew chapter 2, verse 19 through 23, and Luke chapter 2, verse 39 through 40. Jesus in the temple at age 12. Luke chapter 2, verse 41 through 52. Now let's talk about the introduction into the ministry. Approximately 6 months. John the Baptist preaches and baptizes. Matthew chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. Mark chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. Luke chapter 3, verses 1 through 18. Jesus is baptized. Jesus' baptism, in other words. Matthew chapter 3, verses 13 through 17. Mark chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. Luke chapter 3, verses 21 through 23. Jesus' temptation. Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. Mark chapter 1 through verse 12 through 13. And Luke chapter 4, verses 1 through 13. John the Baptist identifies Jesus as the Messiah. John chapter 1, verses 19 through 34. Jesus began to gather followers. John chapter 1, verse 35 through 51. Jesus turns water into wine in Cana. John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. Jesus and his followers travel to Capernaum. John chapter 2, verse 12. Jesus travels to Jerusalem and cleanses the temple for the first time. John chapter 2, verse 13 through 25. Jesus visits with Nicodemus. John chapter 3, verses 1 through 21. Jesus ministers to Judah with his followers. John chapter 3, verse 22 through 24. John the Baptist testifies to Jesus. John chapter 3, verse 26 through 36. And you do know that John the Baptist was the cousin of Jesus, 6 months apart in age. John the Baptist imprisoned by Herod. Matthew chapter 4, verses 12. Chapter 14, verses 3 through 5. And Mark chapter 1 through 4. Mark chapter 1, verse 14. And chapter 6, verses 17 through 20. And Luke chapter 3, verses 19 and 20. Jesus travels through Samaria and encounters the woman at the well, possibly the first conversion. Matthew chapter 4, verses 12. Mark chapter 1, verse 14. Luke chapter 4, verse 14. John chapter 4, verse 1 through 44. Galilean ministry, the Galilean ministry part. Jesus begins first tour of Galilee. Matthew chapter 4, verse 17. Mark chapter 1, verse 14. And verse 14 and 15, I'm sorry. Or chapter 15. And Luke chapter 4, verse 14 and chapter 15. John chapter 4, verse 45. Jesus heals the son of an official. John chapter 4, verse 46 through 54. Jesus teaches in the synagogue in Nazareth. Luke chapter 4, verse 16 through 30. Jesus moves to Capernaum. Matthew chapter 4, verse 13 through 16. Luke chapter 4, verse 31. Jesus heals a lame man on the Sabbath in Jerusalem. John chapter 5, verses 1 through 15. Jesus explains his Sabbath healing. John chapter 5, 16, verse 16 through 47. Jesus calls Peter, Andrew, James, John in Matthew chapter 4, verse 18 and 22, Mark chapter 1, verse 16 through 20, Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. All right. Healing of a demon-possessed man. Okay, that's Mark. Mark chapter 1, verses 21 and verses 23 through 26. Luke chapter 4, verses 33 through 35. The people are amazed at Jesus' teachings. His teaching. In Mark chapter 1, verse 22 and 27 through 28. Luke chapter 4, verse 32 and 36 through 37. Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law. Matthew chapter 8, verses 14 through 15. Mark chapter 1, verse 29 through 31. Luke chapter 4, verse 38 and 39. Healing of crowds in Capernaum. Matthew chapter 8, verse 16 and 17. Mark chapter 1 through 32 and 34. Luke chapter 4, verse 40 to 41. Jesus begins his second tour of Galilee. Matthew chapter 4, verse 23 to 25. Mark chapter 1, verse 35 to 39. Luke chapter 4, verse 42 to 44. Jesus heals a leper. Matthew chapter 8, verse 1 through 4. Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 45. Luke chapter 5, verse 12 through 16. Jesus heals a man who was paralyzed. Matthew chapter 9, verses 1 through 8. Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Luke chapter 5, verse 17 through 26. Jesus calls Matthew. Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 through 13. Mark chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. Luke chapter 5, verses 27 through 32. Teaching on fasting. Matthew chapter 9, verse 14 through 17. Mark chapter 2, verses 18 through 22. Luke chapter 5, verses 33 through 39. Jesus criticized for picking grain on the Sabbath. Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through 28. Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. Jesus heals a hand on the Sabbath. Matthew chapter 12, verses 9 through 14. Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Luke chapter 6, verses 6 through 11. Jesus heals at the Sea of Galilee. Matthew chapter 12, verses 15 through 21. Mark chapter 3, verses 7 through 12. Jesus chooses the 12. Matthew chapter 10, verses 2 through 4, I'm sorry. Matthew chapter 10, verses 2 through 4. Mark chapter 3, verse 13 through 19. Luke chapter 6, verses 12 through 16. Jesus preaches the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5, 1 through 7 and verse 29. Luke chapter 6, verse 17 through 49. Jesus heals a Syrian slave. Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 through 13. Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. Jesus raises a widow's son. Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 17. Jesus reassures John the Baptist. Matthew chapter 11, verses 1 through 19. Luke chapter 7, verse 18 through 35. People of Galilee rebuked for their unbelief. Matthew chapter 11, verse 20 through 24. Jesus invites the weary to follow him. Promises rest. Matthew chapter 11, verses 25 through 30. Jesus anointed by a sinful woman. In Luke chapter 7, verse 36 through 50. Jesus tours Galilee again. In Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. Jesus heals a blind man. Matthew chapter 12, verse 22 and going to 24. Jesus responds to the Pharisees' charge of blasphemy. Matthew chapter 12, verses 25 through 37. Mark chapter 3, verses 20 through 30. Jesus rebukes those who seek only a sign. Matthew chapter 12, verse 38 through 45. Jesus' mother and brothers do not understand him. And Matthew chapter 12, verses 46 through 50. Mark chapter 3, verses 31 through 35. Luke chapter 8 through 19 to 21. And that, brethren and friends, is a common occurrence within the faith. Jesus teaches the parable. Sorry, I should have turned my phone off, my bad. Where was I? Jesus teaches, where was I at? Jesus teaches the parable of the sower. Jesus teaches the parable of the sower, Matthew chapter 13, verses 1 through 9. Mark chapter 4, verse 1 through 9. Luke chapter 8, verses 4 through 8. Jesus explains to his disciples why he teaches in parables. Matthew chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. Mark chapter 4, verses 10 through 12. Luke chapter 8, verse 10. Jesus explains the parable of the sower. In Matthew chapter 13, verses 18 through 23. Mark chapter 4, verses 13 through 20. Luke chapter 8, verses 9 through 15. Jesus uses the metaphor of a lamp and a lampstand. Matthew chapter 4, verses 21 through 25. Luke chapter 8, verses 16 through 18. Jesus refers to the seed of God. Jesus refers to the seed of God's kingdom in Mark chapter 4, verses 26 through 29. Jesus teaches the parable of the wheat and the weeds. Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30. Jesus teaches the parable of the mustard seed. Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 through 32. Mark chapter 4, verses 30 through 32. Luke chapter 13, verses 18 through 19. Jesus teaches the parable of the yeast. Matthew chapter 13, verse 33. Mark chapter 13, verses 20 and 21. Jesus fulfills Psalm 78:2. In Matthew 13, verse 34 through 35. Mark chapter 4, verses 33 and 34. Jesus explains the parable of the wheat and the weeds in Matthew chapter 13, verses 36 and 43. And Jesus teaches the parable of the hidden treasure in Matthew chapter 13, verse 44. Jesus teaches the parable of the pearl, Matthew chapter 13, verses 45 and 46. Jesus teaches the parable of the net, Matthew chapter 13, verses 47 through 50. Jesus teaches the parable of the landowner, Matthew chapter 13, verses 51 through 52. Jesus calms the storm, Matthew chapter 8, verses 18 verses 23 through 27, Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41, and Luke chapter 8, verse 22 through 25. Jesus restores the man living among the tombs, Matthew chapter 8, verses 28 through 34, Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 20, Luke chapter 8, verses 26 through 39. Jesus heals the hemorrhaging woman, Matthew chapter 9, verses 20 to 22. Mark chapter 5, verses 24 and 34. Luke chapter 8, verses 42 and 48. Jesus heals Jairus' daughter, Matthew chapter 9, verses 18 through 19, 23 through 26. Mark chapter 5 and 20, verses 21 through 24, and verses 35 through 43. Luke chapter 8, verses 40 through 42, and 49 through 56. Jesus heals two blind men, Matthew chapter 9, verses 27 through 31. Jesus heals a demon-possessed man, Matthew chapter 9, verses 32 to 34. Jesus visits Nazareth is rejected again, Matthew chapter 13, verses 53 through 58, and in Mark chapter 6, verses 1 through 6. Jesus sends out his disciples to preach, heal, Matthew chapter 10, verses 1, 5, and going into 42. Matthew chapter 6, verse 6 into 30 and 13. Luke chapter 9, verses 1 through 6. And let's see, Herod orders the execution of John the Baptist. Matthew chapter 14, verses 6 through 12. Mark chapter 6, verses 17 through 29. Herod wonders if Jesus is the resurrected John the Baptist. Mark chapter 6, verses 14 through 16. Luke chapter 9, verses 7 through 9. Now, seasons of withdrawal from Galilee. Let's go into these many different verses and events. Jesus feeds the 5,000. 5 loaves and 2 fish is what he uses. Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. Mark chapter 6, verses 30 through 44. Luke chapter 9, verses 10 through 17. John chapter 6, verses 1 through 15. Jesus walks on water. Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 into 33. Mark chapter 6, verses 45 into 52. Luke chapter 6, verses 16 into 21. Jesus' message on the bread of life. John chapter 6, verses 22 through 71. Pharisees rebuke Jesus due to unclean hands. Matthew chapter 15, verses 1 through 20. Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 23. Jesus heals the Canaanite woman's daughter. Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 through 28. Mark chapter 7, verses 24 through 30. Jesus heals a deaf man. Mark chapter 7, verses 31 through 37. Jesus heals many on the mountain near the Sea of Galilee. Matthew chapter 15, verses 29 through 31. Jesus feeds the 4,000. Matthew chapter 15, verses 32 through 38. Mark chapter 8, verses 1 through 10. Sadducees ask for a sign. The Pharisees and Sadducees ask for a sign. Matthew chapter 15, verses 39 through Matthew chapter 15, verses 39 and chapter 16, verses 4. Mark chapter 8, verses 11 through 12. And Jesus warns others of the Pharisees, Sadducees' influence. Matthew chapter 16, verses 5 through 12. Mark chapter 8, verses 13 through 21. Jesus heals a blind man in Bethsaida. It's not Bethsaida. It's Bethsaida. Mark chapter 8, verses 22 to 30, or 22 to 26. Peter confesses Jesus is the Christ. Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 to 20. Mark chapter 8, verses 27 through 30. Luke chapter 9, verses 18 through 20. Jesus foretells of his death and resurrection. Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 28. Mark chapter 8, verses 31 and chapter 9, verse 1. Luke chapter 9, verse 21 through 27. Jesus' transfiguration before disciples. Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 8. Mark chapter 9, verses 2 through 8. Luke chapter 9 through 28 to 36. Jesus talks to Elijah and John the Baptist. Matthew chapter 17, verses 9 through 13. Mark chapter 9, verses 9 through 13. Jesus cast out a belligerent demon from a boy. Matthew chapter 17, verses 14 through 21. Mark chapter 9, verses 14 through 29. Luke chapter 9, verses 37 through 43. Jesus foretells of his own death and resurrection again. Matthew chapter 17, verses 22 to 23. Mark chapter 9, verses 30 through 32. Luke chapter 43 through 45. Jesus produces a coin to pay the temple tax. Matthew chapter 17, verses 23 or 24 through 27. Jesus teaches about service and giving. Jesus teaches about service and gives warnings. Matthew chapter 18, verses 1 through 11. Mark chapter 9, verses 33 through 50. Luke chapter 9, verses 46 through 50. Jesus teaches about the reclamation and ministering in his name. Okay, and that's in Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through 20. Jesus teaches the parable of the unforgiving slave. Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 through 35. Jesus refuses to destroy a Samaritan village. Luke chapter 9, verse 51 through 56. Jesus challenges his followers to full commitment. Matthew chapter 8, verses 19 through 22. Luke chapter 9, verses 57 through 62. Now we'll talk about the Judean ministry. Jesus hesitates to go to Jerusalem. John chapter 7, verses 1 through 9. Jesus discuss Jesus' discussion at the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Festival of Tabernacles, however they want to word it, in this notes here. John chapter 7, verses 10 through 52. Jesus forgives a woman accused of adultery. John chapter 7, verses 53, and John chapter 8, verse 11. Jesus claims to be the light of the world. John chapter 8, verses 12 through 59. Jesus heals a blind man from birth. John chapter 9, verses 1 through 41. John claims to be the good shepherd. I'm sorry, not John, Jesus. Jesus claims to be the good shepherd. John chapter 10, verses 1 through 21. Jesus sends out 70 to preach. Luke chapter 10, verse 1 through 24. Jesus teaches the parable of the Good Samaritan. Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. Jesus visits Mary and Martha in Bethany. In Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42. Jesus teaches the disciples how to pray. Matthew chapter 6, verse 9 through 15. Luke chapter 11, verses 1 through 13. Jesus accused of healing through Beelzebul. In other words, the devil. Luke chapter 11, verses 14 through 26. Beelzebul. I can never pronounce that correctly. Jesus responds to a blessing. Luke chapter 11, verses 27 through 28. The sign of Jonah. And you know the great fish and Jonah the great fish. Luke chapter 11, verse 29 through 36. Pharisees and law experts criticize Jesus. Luke chapter 11, verses 37 through 54. Jesus warns of the Pharisees' deceptions. Luke chapter 12, verses 1 through 12. Jesus teaches the parable of the rich fool. Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 21. Jesus teaches the parables of the wildflowers and the ravens. Luke chapter 12, verses 22 through 34. Jesus foretells his second coming in Luke chapter 12, verses 35 through 48. Jesus foretells his crucifixion. Luke chapter 12, verses 49 through 59. Jesus teaches the parable of the barren fig tree. Luke chapter 13, verses 1 through 9. Jesus heals a woman with a crooked back, scoliosis. Luke chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. Jesus claims to be one with God. And that's John chapter 10, verses 22 through 42. Okay, now we've got those parts. Let's go. Parian ministry. And this is approximately a 3-month preaching quest here. Jesus teaches about the narrow way. Luke chapter 13, verses 22 through 30. Jesus is warned about Herod. Luke chapter 13, verses 31 through 33. Jesus expressed sorrow for Jerusalem. Matthew chapter 23, verses 37 through 39. Luke chapter 13, verses 34 through 35. Jesus heals a bloated man. Luke chapter 14, verses 1 through 6. Jesus teaches about humility. Luke chapter 14, verses 7 through 14. Jesus teaches the parable of the large banquet. Luke chapter 14, verse 15 through 24. The cost of following Jesus. Luke chapter 14, verses 25 through 35. Jesus teaches the parable of the lost sheep. Matthew chapter 18, verses 12 through 14. Luke chapter 15, 1 through 7. Jesus teaches the parable of the lost coin. Luke chapter 15, verses 8 through 10. Jesus teaches the parable of the lost son. Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. Jesus teaches the parable of the dishonest manager. Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 18. Jesus teaches the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31. Jesus teaches about faith and service. Luke chapter 17, verses 1 through 10. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. John chapter 11, verses 1 through 44. The centurion plots against Jesus. John chapter 11, verses 45 through 54. Jesus heals 10 lepers on his way to Jerusalem. Luke chapter 17, verses 11 through 19. Jesus teaches about the advent of the kingdom. The advent of the kingdom. Luke chapter 17. Luke chapter 17, verses 20 through 37. The parable on prayer. The persistent widow. Okay. Luke chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. The parable on prayer, the proud Pharisees and the tax collector. Luke chapter 18, verse 9 through 14. Jesus discusses divorce and remarriage. Matthew chapter 19, verses 1 through 12. Mark chapter 10, verses 1 through 12. Luke chapter 16, verse 18. Jesus welcomes little children. Matthew chapter 19, verses 13 through 15. Mark chapter 10, verses 13 through 16. Luke chapter 18, verses 15 through 17. Jesus and the rich young ruler. Matthew chapter 19, verses 16 through 30. Mark chapter 10, verses 17 through 31. Luke chapter 18, verse 18 through 30. And Jesus teaches the parable of the vineyard workers. Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. Jesus again discussed his death and resurrection. Matthew chapter 20, verses 17 through 19. Mark chapter 10, verses 32 to 34. Luke chapter 18, verses 31 to 34. James and John asked for where am I at? James and John asked for prominence in Jesus' kingdom. So James and John asked for prominence in Jesus' kingdom. Matthew chapter 20, verses 20 through 28. Mark chapter 10, verses 35 through 45. Jesus heals blind Bartimaeus. And that's in Matthew chapter 20, verses 29 through 30. Mark chapter 10, verses 46 through 52. Luke chapter 18, verses 35 through 43. Jesus talks with Zacharias. Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. Jesus teaches the parable of the minas. Luke chapter 19, verse 11 through 27. Passion. We're going on to the passion part. This is the 7-day passion part. The centurion plots against Jesus and Lazarus. John chapter 11, verses 55, and chapter 12, verse 1 through 9, and verse 11. Okay, that was John chapter 11, verse 55, and John chapter 12, verses 1 and 9 through 11. Okay, there we go. Mary of Bethania anoints Jesus. Matthew chapter 26, verses 6 through 13, Mark chapter 14, verses 3 through 9, John chapter 12, verses 2 through 8, Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem, Matthew chapter 21, verses 1 through 11, Mark chapter 11, verses 1 through 11, Mark chapter 19, verses 28 through 44, John chapter 12, verses 12 through 19, Jesus curses the fig tree, Matthew chapter 21, verses 18 through 19, Mark chapter 11, verses 12 through 14, Jesus cleanses the temple and the ministry there, and that's in Matthew chapter 21, verses 12 through 17, Mark chapter 11, verses 15 through 19, Luke chapter 19, verses 45 through 48. Greeks ask to see Jesus, in John chapter 12, verses 20 and verse 20 to 22. Jesus predicts his death, John chapter 12, verses 23 to 36. Jews continue in their unbelief, and that's John chapter 12, verses 37 through 50. Jesus teaches about the withered fig tree, Matthew chapter 21, verses 20 through 22, Mark chapter 11, verses 20 through 26. The centurion asks Jesus' authority. The centurion questions Jesus' authority. Matthew chapter 21, verses 23 through 27, Mark chapter 11, verses 27 through 33, Luke chapter 20, verses 1 through 8. Jesus teaches the parable of two vineyard workers, Matthew chapter 21, verses 28 through 32. Jesus teaches the parable of the vineyard owner, Matthew chapter 21, verses 33 through 46, Mark chapter 12, verses 1 through 12, Luke chapter 20, verses 9 through 19. Jesus teaches the parable of the wedding feast, Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. Jesus quizzed about paying tax to Caesar, Matthew chapter 22, verses 15 through 22, Mark chapter 12, verses 13 to 17, Luke chapter 20, verses 20 to 26. The Sadducees questions Jesus about resurrection, Matthew chapter 22, verses 23 to 33, Mark chapter 12, verses 18 to 27, Luke chapter 20, verses 27 to 40. Jesus teaches the greatest commandment, Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 through 40. Mark chapter 12, verses 28 to 34. Jesus discusses the identity of the demonic Messiah, Matthew chapter 22, verses 41 through 46. Mark chapter 12, verses 35 through 37. Luke chapter 20, verses 41 through 44. Jesus rebukes the scribes and the Pharisees, Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 36. Mark chapter 12, verses 38 to 40. Luke chapter 20, verses 45 to 47. Jesus teaches about the widow's sacrificial giving. Mark chapter 12, verses 41 through 44. Luke chapter 21, verses 1 through 4. Jesus' great prophetic disclosure. Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 through 51. Mark chapter 13, verses 1 through 37. Luke chapter 21, verses 5 through 38. Jesus teaches the parable of the 10 virgins, Matthew chapter 25, verses 1 through 13. All right. Jesus teaches the parable of the talents, Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. Jesus uses the analogy of sheep and goats, Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 through 46. The Shadarian continued their plot against Jesus, Matthew chapter 26, verses 1 through 5, Mark chapter 14, verses 1 through 2, Luke chapter 22, verses 1 through 2. Judas plans to betray Jesus. Matthew chapter 26 verses 14 through 16. Mark chapter 14 verses 10 through 11. Luke chapter 22 verses 3 through 6. Preparations made for the Passover meal. Matthew chapter 26 verses 17 through 19. Mark chapter 14 verses 12 through 16. Luke chapter 22 verses 7 through 13. Jesus washes the disciples' feet. John chapter 13 verses 1 through 20. Jesus identifies Judah as the betrayer. Matthew chapter 26 verses 20 through 25. Mark chapter 14 verse 17 to 21. Luke chapter 22 verses 21 to 23. John chapter 13 verses 21 through 30. Jesus gives a new commandment. John chapter 13 verses 31 to 35. Jesus foretells his disciples denial of him. Matthew chapter 26 verses 31 through 35. Mark chapter 14 verses 27 to 31. Luke chapter 22 verses 31 to 38. John chapter 13 verses 36 to 38. Jesus teaches about true greatness. Luke chapter 22 verses 24 to 30. Jesus institutes the meal of remembrance. Matthew chapter 26 verses 26 to 30. Mark chapter 14 verses 22 to 25. Luke chapter 22 verses 14 to 20. Jesus' farewell to his disciples. John chapter 14 verses 1 through 16 and verse 33. Jesus intercedes for his disciples. Intercedes for his disciples. John chapter 17 verses 1 through 26. Jesus' agony in the Garden of Gethsemane. Matthew chapter 26 verses 36 through 46. Mark chapter 14 verse 26, 32 to 42. Luke chapter 22 verses 39 to 46. Jesus betrayed, arrested. Matthew chapter 26 verses 47 through 56. Mark chapter 14 verses 43 to 52. Luke chapter 22 verses 47 to 53. John chapter 18 verses 1 through 12. Jesus hearing before Ananias. John chapter 18 verses 12, 14. John chapter 8 verse 12 through 14, and John 18 verses 19 to 23. Jesus appears before Caiaphas. Matthew chapter 26, verse 57, verse 59 through 68. Mark chapter 14, verses 53 through 65. John chapter 22, verses 54, 63 to 65. John chapter 18, verse 24. Peter denies knowing Jesus. Matthew chapter 26, verses 58 and 69 to 75. Mark chapter 14, verses 54 and verses 66 to 72. Luke chapter 22, verse 54 to 62. John chapter 18, verses 15 through 18, and 25 to verse 27. Senderin condemns Jesus. Senderin, however you pronounce that. Matthew chapter 27, verses 1 through 12. Mark chapter 15, verses 1. Luke chapter 22, verses 66 through 71. Judas Iscariot commits suicide. Matthew chapter 27, verses 3 to 10. Jesus' first hearing before Pilate, Jesus' first hearing before Pilate. Matthew chapter 27 verses 2 and verses 11 through 14. Mark chapter 15 verses 1 and 5. Luke chapter 23 verses 1 through 5. John chapter 18 verses 28 through 38. Pilate sends Jesus to Herod. Lost my place. Sorry, just give me a moment. Antipas. So Pilate sends Jesus to Herod Antipas. Luke chapter 23 verses 6 through 10. Herod returns Jesus to Pilate. Luke chapter 23 verse 11 through 12. Jesus is condemned to death in place of Barbarius. Matthew chapter 27 verses 15 through 26. Mark chapter 15 verses 6 through 15. Luke chapter 23 verses 13 through 25. Luke chapter 18 verses 39 to and chapter 19 verse 16. Soldiers mock Jesus. Matthew chapter 27 verse 27 to 31. Mark chapter 15 verse 16 to 20. Simon carries Jesus' cross. Matthew chapter 27 verse 32. Mark chapter 15 verse 21. Luke chapter 23 verse 26. Jesus speaks to the daughters of Jerusalem. Luke chapter 23 verse 27 verse 31 to verse 31. Jesus is crucified. Matthew chapter 27 verse 33 to 37. Mark chapter 15 verse 22 to 26. Luke chapter 23 verses 33 to 34. John chapter 19 to verse 17 to 24. Women and followers at the cross include Mary. Matthew chapter 27 verses 55 and 56. Mark chapter 15 verses 40 and 41. Luke chapter 23 verse 49. John chapter 19 verses 25 to 27. Crowd mocks Jesus. Matthew chapter 27 verse 39 to 43. Mark chapter 15 verses 29 to 32. Luke chapter 23 verses 35 to 38. Two criminals crucified with Jesus. Matthew chapter 27 verse 38 verse 44. Mark chapter 15 verse 40 or 27 to 28. Luke chapter 23 verses 32 and 39 to 43. Supernatural and final events surrounding Jesus' death. Matthew chapter 27 verses 45 to 54. Mark chapter 15 verses 33 to 39. Luke chapter 23 verses 44 to 48. John chapter 19 to 28 to 30. Soldiers pierce Jesus' side. Soldier pierces Jesus' side. John chapter 19 verse 31 to 37. Jesus buried in tomb of Joseph and Mary and Mary. Can't even pronounce it right now. Maritha. Matthew chapter 27 verse 57 to 60. Mark chapter 15 to verse 42 to 46. Luke chapter 23 to verse 50 to 54. John chapter 19 verses 38 to 42. Women mourn at Jesus' tomb. Matthew chapter 27 verse 61. Mark chapter 15 verse 47. Luke chapter 23 verses 55 and 56. The resurrection and appearance. Jesus is resurrected. Matthew chapter 28 verse 2 to 4. Women visit the tomb and anoint Jesus' body. Matthew chapter 28 to verse 1. Mark chapter 16 verses 1 through 4. Luke chapter 24 verses 1 through 2. Women discover the empty tomb. Matthew chapter 28 verses 5 through 7. Mark chapter 16 verses 5 through 8. Luke chapter 24, verses 3 to 8. John chapter 20, verses 1 through 2. Peter and John hurry to the tomb. Luke chapter 24, verses 9 through 12. John chapter 20, verses 3 through 10. Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene. Mark chapter 16, verses 8 through 11. John chapter 20, verses 11 through 18. Jesus sends the woman to tell the disciples. Matthew chapter 28, verses 8 through 10. Shandarian bribes soldiers. Matthew chapter 28, verses 11 through 15. Jesus appears to Jesus appears to two on the road to Emmaus, and that's in Luke chapter 24, Emmaus, and chapter 24 of Luke, verses 13 through 35. Other appearances by Jesus in Mark chapter 16, verses 12 through 13. Jesus appears to his disciples. Thomas was absent, and that was in Luke chapter 24, verses 36 and 49. John chapter 20, verses 19 to 25. And Jesus appears to Thomas and the other disciples on John chapter 20, verse 26 through 29. A great catch at the Sea of Galilee. John chapter 21, verses 1 through 14. Jesus reinstates Peter. John chapter 21, verses 15 through 19. Jesus and Peter discuss Apostle John's future. John chapter 21, verses 20 through 24. Jesus commissions disciples to continue his work. Matthew chapter 28, verses 16 through 20. Mark chapter 16 through 18. Acts chapter 4 through 8. And Jesus ascends to the Father into the third heaven. Mark chapter 16, verses 19 to 20. Luke chapter 24, verses 50 to 53. And Acts chapter 1, verse 9. So there we have it, brethren, friends, a complete list of what Jesus did with his life. How many of God's people do you see out there doing these things? How many of people out there that claim they're ministers and Christians do these things that Jesus did? The kind of character he had. Know the character of Jesus Christ. Well, I hope this was informative and helpful in knowing Jesus and knowing what to look for and stay away from that are connected to using the character or using the name of Jesus. We got to be careful. Okay, brethren and friends, hope that everyone has a wonderful week. Stay safe, and we'll see you next Sabbath.